Hello and welcome to this panel presentation at the United Nations Human Rights Council 50th session in Geneva, Switzerland. This presentation is titled The Continuing Negative Impact of Colonialism. It is under the auspices of In Common Dios, an NGO in consultative status with the Economic and Social Council of the United Nations. Both the United Nations General Assembly and the Human Rights Council have adopted strong resolutions to eliminate colonialism. On 10 December 2020, the General Assembly adopted Resolution 75/123, declaring the fourth international decade for the eradication of colonialism. On 8 October 2021, the Human Rights Council passed Resolution 48-7, calling attention to the negative impact of the legacies of colonialism on the enjoyment of human rights. This panel discusses the anomaly that, despite declaring such noble intentions, colonialism persists around the globe, and very little, if any, concrete actions are being taken by the United Nations to free nations in captivity or to end various forms of deleterious colonial practices. Today we have speakers from Alaska, Hawaii, and Okinawa. We also have a special presentation by Dr. Alfred Dzius. And my name is Robert Kajiwara, president of the Peace For Okinawa Coalition, a nonprofit organization headquartered in Okinawa City with an extension office in Honolulu in the Hawaiian Kingdom. And I will be moderating today's panel discussion, as well as sharing about the current issues in Okinawa surrounding colonialism. We also have with us Ambassador Ronald Barnes of the Native Peoples of Alaska. He was first appointed as the Director of Foreign Relations by the Tununak Elders Council, Chair of Indigenous Peoples and Nations Coalition for Alaska. The entity is designated as the free political institution and is now supported by the vast majority of tribal governments in Alaska. Ambassador Barnes resides in Geneva and is the head of mission for the Alaska Decolonization Movement. He has worked tirelessly for nearly 30 years in advocacy for the rights of the Indigenous peoples of Alaska. And also with us today is H.E. Leon Kalahau-Siu, Minister of Foreign Affairs of the Hawaiian Kingdom. Minister Siu is a prominent strategist, advocate, and spokesperson for Hawaii's independence. He is a familiar participant in Geneva at the Human Rights Council and is working to restore or develop new relations between the Hawaiian Kingdom and other states. He is the chair of the Decolonization Alliance based in New York City, a co-author of the book Modus Vivendi, Situation of West Papua, and was nominated for the 2017 Nobel Peace Prize. Ambassador Barnes and Minister Siu, thank you so much for taking the time out of your busy schedules to join us today for this presentation. So, talking about the so-called Legacies of Colonialism resolution, which the UN passed last year. This was a very important resolution, and many oppressed peoples around the world still struggling with the negative impact of colonialism strongly praised this resolution. However, as I said in the introduction, we haven't seen much follow-up to that yet. We haven't seen a whole lot of concrete or practical action taken by the UN. So this is what we would like to discuss today. The importance of this resolution, and also what are the next steps that we would like to see the UN take. Now, Ambassador Barnes, you played a critical role in helping get this resolution passed last year. And so, first of all, we would like to thank you for your work. And we would also like to ask you to open us up to talk about why this resolution is so important. Okay. So Ambassador Barnes, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you, Leon. Thank you, Robert. And thank you for your organizations for assembling this meeting. And also, thank you for putting it together. Of course, as you said, it was adopted on October 8th of the 48th session of the Human Rights Council. Resolution HRC 48.7, titled The Negative Impact of Legacies of Colonialism on the Enjoyment of Human Rights. I've gone over this in a number of meetings informing other groups, and so I'll try to do this within 25 minutes, but I'll see if after 20 minutes we have covered sufficiently what I believe we need to cover. Of course, I'm going to just go to what I believe are the relevant preambular paragraphs and also the operative paragraphs, point out the essence of what the thrust of this is about, and also why this is, in essence, revolutionary at the Human Rights Council. And for that, we can thank China and what I like to call the like-minded group and sponsors, which is Russia. And maybe I shouldn't name them because I don't have them in front of me at once. But this resolution in preambular paragraph 3 is recalling all relevant international human rights treaties. So any international human rights treaty that is relevant to this is called. Also preambular paragraph 4, then this is vitally important, calls for further the Declaration on the Granting of Independence of Colonial Countries and Peoples and the Durban Declaration and Program of Action. The Durban Declaration Program of Action is important because it calls on all states to recognize from the major 2001 World Conference Against Racism to look also at the International Covenant on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination and to remove all obstacles so that we can address all facets and all practices of race and racial discrimination. So this acknowledges the crucial role of the General Assembly and the Special Committee on the Situation with regard to the implementation of the Declaration on the Granting of Independence to Colonial Countries and Peoples on the matters of decolonization. And just to bring to your attention from preambular paragraph 5, why this is vitally important, because this puts us right into the scope of United Nations 1960 General Assembly Resolution 1514, which I just read the title of, and that's the Granting of Independence of Colonial Countries and Peoples. What is also important about this resolution, and I say this after mentioning preambular paragraph 5, is that this resolution does not highlight or bring into question the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, and this is vitally important to us. Why so? Because in 2014, the United Nations General Assembly attempts to reduce the scope of the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples to domestic law. And it says so in one of the paragraphs of the conference document. And so we assert our right as subjects of international law, as Alaska and Hawaii were originally listed in General Assembly Resolution 66I in 1946 to be decolonized using the same factors and principles and also those guidelines that were put into place so that we as peoples recognized in the territories of Alaska and Hawaii would also be recognized equally under Article 1.2 of the Charter, which is the equal right and self-determination of peoples. And this is vitally important also because when Professor Miguel Alfonso Martinez completed his study from the former Subcommission on Human Rights, he stated that it is vitally important that Indigenous peoples, bar none, have the right to utilize the phrase equal right and self-determination of peoples. And the history of that very phrase under Article 1.2 of the Charter, states were proposing to use equal right and self-determination of states, and what won over at that time was equal right and self-determination of peoples, and that was to put peoples equal with states. And if you look at the historical record, that is exactly the intention and the meaning of that. This is not only about states. This is about peoples who are vested with the right of self-determination under international law. And Alaska and Hawaii have this status. And as former members of the subcommission, I say former only because it was dissolved when they created the Human Rights Council. And they asserted that, and without question, are you to allow any state, any United Nations body or institution to diminish the scope and status of your right as peoples under international law? And I don't know if Alfred or Leon, but I'm just going to mention a recent case in the Supreme Court of the United States, where the United States Supreme Court stated that these territories are outside the jurisdiction or community of the United States. And under the US Constitution, of course, we lie outside the political community of the United States of America, as established by principles under international law, especially the Declaration on the Declaration on Foreign Relations, which states that we remain separate and distinct until we decide the status of our territories and the status of our peoples. Now, PP6 talks about reaffirming the existence of colonialism in any form or manifestation, including economic exploitation, is incompatible with the Charter, and again recalls the Declaration on the Granting of Independence to Colonial Countries and Peoples and the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Of course, I like to point out the Universal Declaration does mention non-self-governing peoples in Article 2 and in Article, not Article 17, but Article 17 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights has to do with property rights. And that's what we are virtually being denied by domestic law. When I point this out, it is vitally important, and this was said to me again by United Nations experts, international jurists, among them the late Ian Brownlee, who stated that you cannot use domestic law or its deficiencies to settle an international obligation. I was asked by experts why I put this more than once, and I will repeat it again in my documents. And I said, because when states hear this, or experts, they don't understand that you cannot use the domestic law of the United States or its deficiencies to settle the situations of Alaska and Hawaii. Again, the maxim or tenet or principle under international law, you cannot use domestic law or its deficiencies to settle an international obligation. And this was pointed out by more than one expert, including experts from Europe. Preambular paragraph 7 acknowledges the fourth international decade for the eradication of colonialism, and that all member states, as specialized agencies and other organizations of the United Nations system, and other governmental and non-governmental organizations are invited to actively support and participate in the implementation of the plan of action during the fourth international decade for the eradication of colonialism. What this means is that we need to be invited in our capacity of peoples or nations, states, to present our case and to petition to remove General Assembly Resolution 1469, which removed Alaska and Hawaii in 1959 with many irregularities and violations of the factors and principles that were not practiced or put into place when we were removed in 1959 without our participation and without our consent. Of course, PP8, and I'm again stressing what I believe is necessary, stressing the role of the Human Rights Council in promoting universal respect for human rights and fundamental freedoms for all. The word universal respect, the phrase is vitally important to us because they must not only recognize the universal aspect of the right of self-determination, what we believe and what we've sent to the United Nations General Assembly, to the Secretary General, to the High Commissioner for Human Rights, to the President of ECOSOC, and to also the United Nations Human Rights Council, that we believe we have the right not to be reduced to domestic law or to any scope under domestic law in the expert mechanism on the rights of Indigenous peoples. And we do not want even the expert mechanism for the right to development to reduce us in scope or status. Also in what is developing as a binding instrument for an international instrument on the right to development. We believe we have this right to international law and not to be reduced again to domestic law. PP9 says, recognizing with concern the legacies of colonialism and all their manifestations. Again, in all their manifestations, inter alia, economic exploitation, inequality within and among states, systematic racism, violations of Indigenous peoples' rights, contemporary form of slavery, etc. Now, PP10 recognizes that colonialism has led to racism, racial discrimination, xenophobia, and related intolerance, and that peoples and Africa and people of African descent, Asians and peoples of Asian descent, and Indigenous peoples were victims of colonialism and continue to be victims of its consequence. PP 11, this is the last paragraph prior to the operative paragraphs, which says states calls on the need and stressing the need for states to take all measures necessary to protect rights and ensure the safety of Indigenous peoples, especially Indigenous women and children, and to restore truth and justice and to hold perpetrators accountable. We would like this as part of, as stated in the operative paragraphs. Of course, OP1 stresses the utmost importance for eradicating colonialism and to address the negative impact of the legacies of colonialism. Operative paragraph 2, when we look at this resolution, it should be taken in whole, in the context of the whole scope of the resolution, where we believe we have the right as states of peoples under international law and subjects of international law. If you look up those words and phrases, they're important under international law, phrases that you should not diminish. Again, in any attempt to diminish or to give any excuse to the administering power, which was United States of America in our case and situation. So, operative paragraph 2 calls for member states, relevant United Nations bodies, agencies, and other relevant stakeholders to take concrete steps to address the negative impact of legacies of colonialism on the enjoyment of human rights. This means the concrete action and steps must be taken to address the violation of our right to self-determination under international law. And I will always assert this. Now, paragraphs 3 and 4 were added by Western states, United Kingdom, And there's a reason why we do not, or we did not support adding this. And I'll read it out and I'll state why. Operative paragraph 3 reaffirms that persecution of members of any identifiable group, collective, or community on racial, national, ethnic, or other grounds that are universally recognized as impermissible under international law, and the crime of apartheid constitutes serious violations of human rights, and this is what we're concerned about, this phrase, in some cases, comma, qualify as crimes against humanity. Why does this draw a red light? Because when we were attempting to preserve the original Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples that came out of the 1993 Working Group on Indigenous Populations and the Subcommission of Human Rights to the Commission on Human Rights back then, we fought as Indigenous peoples and stressed that we do not want any qualifications that would allow limitations on the scope and application of any rights, as we may or may not have under international law. And this is where this very paragraph puts into question whether or not crimes against humanity applies to Indigenous peoples, to peoples who are recognized under international law, such as Alaska and Hawaii. Let me read again, and I'm going to go back, not the whole paragraph, but to say, and the crime of apartheid constitute serious violations of human rights and, comma, in some cases, comma, qualify as crimes against humanity. What we are stressing and what we are saying is that these rights apply to us as subjects of international law, and that we don't want any state to attempt to eradicate, to erase, or to diminish in scope, as it applies to us, the crime of apartheid or any serious human rights violation. Why? The crime of apartheid is considered a crime against humanity. And if they attempt to reduce the scope of the right of apartheid to us, then they are discriminating the application of international as it applies to us. Okay, now I'll go on to paragraph 4, also, which was put in by United Kingdom on behalf of the Western states. Urges states to refrain from the forced assimilation of persons belonging to minorities, including Indigenous populations, and to work to ensure that educational curricula and other materials do not stereotype minorities and Indigenous populations on the basis of their ethnicity. Why is this discriminating? We fought long and hard, including at the 1993 Vienna Declaration on Human Rights, to put the word peoples with an S, and not to use Indigenous populations so that states may use that vernacular in an attempt to reduce the scope of our rights as Indigenous peoples. One of the representatives in deliberating or elaborating on the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples stated that there is no United Nations General Assembly resolution that uses the word Indigenous peoples. We refuted that immediately, stating that under the United Nations decolonization process, General Assembly resolutions, if you look at 328 and 329, uses the word Indigenous peoples in the context of our right. And if you look at other resolutions in association with that, to pursue our independence or to restore our independence, whichever, because Alaska was asserted by the United States of America that it did not belong to Russia prior to the 1867 treaty. So that is a reason, one of the reasons why the United States, by its own admission, purchased something that the monarchy of Russia did not own. And of course, as Leon well explained, the monarchy of the Hawaiian Kingdom was a fully acting independent state. So the word indigenous populations can be used as an attempt to reduce the scope and application of our rights. Now, operative paragraph 5 invites United Nations human rights mechanisms and procedures in fulfilling their mandate to continue to pay attention. And it uses the phrase to pay attention to the negative impact of legacies of colonialism in the enjoyment of human rights. So it calls on United Nations human rights mechanisms and procedures. What does this mean? The expert mechanism on the rights of indigenous peoples essentially cannot, because its mandate does not have the right to address or to interact with other UN bodies. And it does not have the right to promote Article 73 based on the United Nations 2014 World Conference on Indigenous Peoples, which we voice that we do not support and will not allow states to reduce the scope and application of our rights. So when you look at them, that's one example of a mechanism, and all the special procedures at the Human Rights Council should promote the integrity of our status without attempting to diminish our rights. And we did a whole document on, after the June 22nd meeting last year, on addressing double standards in human rights. And what we find is that there are many special procedures who go along with the idea that Alaska and Hawaii are part of the United States, when in fact they are not. They were not properly administered, and they do not have the right to claim us as the territorial integrity of the United States of America. Bearing in mind that the phrase territorial integrity, the Declaration on the Granting of Independence of Colonial Countries and Peoples, includes that we have the right to territorial integrity, equal with states under Article 1.2 of the Charter, again, as the equal right and self-determination of peoples. Paragraph 6, now this is where the follow-through for this decides to convene a panel discussion during its 51st session, which is this coming September of 2022, and to make the discussion fully accessible to persons with disabilities, and invites member states, relevant United Nations agencies, international organizations, national human rights institutions, non-governmental organizations, and other stakeholders to participate in the panel and to identify challenges in addressing the negative impact of legacies of colonialism on human rights and to discuss the way forward. So, OP6 says to identify challenges in addressing the negative impact of legacies of colonialism and to discuss the way forward. So we have to discuss the obstacles, the challenges. We can say that there's a lack of political will, and we thank again China and the Human Rights Council for adopting this resolution, and we call on all states not to discriminate against us again, as was as we were discriminated in 1958 and 59, when we could not participate to restore our status under international law. So at the end, of course, operative paragraph 7 requests United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights to provide all necessary resources necessary for the services and facilities for the above mentioned panel discussion. And operative paragraph 8 decides to remain seized on the matter. Of course, if they're going to remain seized on the matter, then as it states, all special procedures and mechanisms should address our human right, in effect, our right of self-determination in the scope of our right under international law and not to diminish us to the deficiencies of domestic law that violate our human rights. I don't know how long I've been talking. Let me take a look. Okay, for half an hour almost. So Robert, there's more that I would like to say. There's more that I can say about some of the obstacles that we face, including in our discussion with diplomats, also with the lack of political will, and the need to start addressing how we are going to address this. I'll give it back to the moderator right now because I've taken 30 minutes, as I can see already. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ambassador Barnes. And we have a smaller panel today, so we can come back to you, and we can have more back and forth discussion, certainly. Now, our friend, Dr. Alfred Dzius, regrets that he was unable to be here with us live today due to a prior commitment, but he was kind enough to take time out of his busy schedule to do a pre-recorded video message just for us, just for this panel. So I would like to show that to you all right now. Just give me 1 second here to share my screen. At this time, we are pleased to welcome back Professor Alfred Dzius. Of course, he has spoken at a number of our panel presentations in the past. Dr. Dzius is professor at the Geneva School of Diplomacy and International Relations. He is a leading expert in the field of human rights and international law, and a high-ranking United Nations official. He was the original UN independent expert for a democratic and equitable international order. He is also a former senior lawyer with the Office of the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, Secretary of the Human Rights Committee, and the Chief of Petitions. He has authored a number of books in several languages. His latest book is titled Building a Just World Order, published by Clarity Press. Professor Dzius, thank you so much for joining us again. The floor is yours.
Good morning, everybody, excellencies, delegates, friends, ladies and gentlemen. We're going to talk today, among other things, about Resolution 48/7 of the 8th of October 2021. This is a really groundbreaking resolution. And those countries that tabled it, those countries that argued for it, those countries that had it adopted deserve the gratitude of the world, not just of the colonial peoples or peoples living under occupation or people who have not reached self-governance. I am very convinced that there must be follow-up to this resolution. What does the resolution say? Well, in upper paragraph 6, it talks about holding a panel. Now, a United Nations panel can be a standard setting panel, but it can also be yet another exercise in futility. It is important that independent experts participate in this panel, and that it not be just friends of governments who essentially want to forget about colonialism and the legacy of colonialism. Colonialism continues today. It's not only the sequels of colonialism, it is the practice of neocolonialism by the Bretton Woods institutions, I mean by the World Bank and by the International Monetary Fund. As you know, 2017, I presented a report to the Human Rights Council on the adverse impacts of certain policies and certain projects of the World Bank. I also presented a report to the General Assembly on the adverse impacts of the International Monetary Fund, particularly in the third world, particularly in highly indebted countries that then essentially become economic hostages of the IMF and of the powerful countries. Now, that is a form of colonialism, and that must end, and people must call a spade a spade. Now, beyond that, I would like to see the Declaration on the Right of Indigenous Peoples be given more substance. I don't agree with all of the declaration. I think that it was very modest, but let's face it, countries are not observing the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. The rights of Indigenous peoples continue being violated systematically by governments that ostensibly are committed to human rights, including the United States and Canada. Now, since the discovery of mass graves outside residential schools and other educational institutions where Indigenous were supposed to be made less Indigenous, where they're supposed to be integrated into the white Anglo-Saxon Protestant societies that we are, that, of course, is a scandal. And Tamara Starblanket, in her book, Suffer of the Little Children, she explains it very well with regard to Canada, but we had the same problem in the United States. That is actually only the tip of the iceberg. The Indigenous peoples in the United States and Canada today are still being exploited. Their natural resources are still being taken away from them. And the idea of a free, prior, and informed consent is not being observed. I allow myself to quote from the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, also same language in the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, Article 1. All peoples have the right of self-determination. But then Article 2, all peoples may, for their own ends, dispose of their natural wealth and resources without prejudice to any obligations arising out of international economic cooperation based upon the principle of mutual benefit and international law. In no case, I repeat, in no case may a people be deprived of its own means of subsistence. Well, that has happened. And I think that the Indigenous, in many countries, the Indigenous are as poor as church mice. They're not even able to hire appropriate legal representation in order to go to domestic courts and fight for their rights. But what I insist on is that this mindset, this attitude of holier than thou, this attitude that we, the rich countries, we can tell the poor countries what is good for them, that has to be abandoned. That is a, shall we say, a vestige of colonialism. Today, there are other forms of economic colonialism in the form of unilateral coercive measures, which is a form of blackmail. You want countries to vote your way, so you apply a degree of pressure on them in the General Assembly, in the ECOSOC, in the Human Rights Council, in order to get your way. But that, of course, is contrary to the letter and spirit of the UN Charter, and contrary to the right of self-determination and to the principle of the sovereign equality of states. Now, looking at this groundbreaking resolution 48/7, I found that the operative paragraphs do not ask enough. I think the upper paragraphs must ask for substantial reparations to be paid to all the colonial peoples. And that is probably why a certain number of countries who did not dare to vote against the adoption of the resolution, but countries who abstained, who did not support the language of the resolution. Among those countries, allow me to read: Austria, Bahrain, Bulgaria, Czechia, Denmark, France, Germany, Italy, Japan, Libya, Marshall Islands, Mauritania, Netherlands, Poland, Republic of Korea, Senegal, Togo, Ukraine, United Kingdom, and Uzbekistan. I consider that a disgrace. And if there are any delegates in the room right now from these countries, I would ask you to take the floor and explain why your delegation voted against adoption of this rather moderate, rather modest resolution. As I said, a panel will be held. Let us hope that that panel actually has a plan of action, that that panel will put forward a roadmap in order to achieve the rights contained in the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, a model d'emploi, how to ensure that free, prior, and informed consent means something. Allow me to read briefly from the 25 principles of international order that I formulated for the Human Rights Council back in 2018, and which I published in Building a Just World Order. Principle 10, the right of self-determination of peoples as stipulated in the UN Charter and in Common Article 1 of the ICCPR on ICES, is a fundamental principle of international law, jus cogens, and international public policy. All peoples, I repeat, all peoples without exception are rights holders of self-determination. The duty bearers are all states members of the UN. The exercise of self-determination is an expression of democracy, as democracy is an expression of self-determination. It attains enhanced legitimacy when a referendum is organized and monitored under the auspices of the United Nations. Now, we're not talking just about decolonization. We're talking about decolonized countries that have a right to self-determination, have a right to their own futures, their own identities and cultures. The European colonization of Africa left totally, shall we say, absurd frontiers in Africa, straight lines cutting through ethnic groups, religious groups, linguistic groups, etc., separating peoples. Now, these peoples have a right to their self-determination. And the United Nations should be the first to recognize that, and should be the first to organize self-determination referenda for these people who have not attained self-determination. Among them, I can think of the boobies of the Oko, of Fernando Po, which was joined with Equatorial Guinea against their will. And I can think of Southern Cameroon that wants to be separate from Northern Cameroon. But I can think of so many countries in the world. I can think of so many peoples, whether it be Okinawa, the Ryukyu Islands, that are supposedly under Japanese sovereignty, but they're not Japanese. I mean, they are Ryukyuans. They have a right to their self-determination. The same goes for the Moluccans. The same thing goes for the West Papuans and for the Rapa Nuis or for the Mapuches of Chile. These are important issues. And I think that the realization of self-determination must be recognized as a conflict prevention strategy. And it is the vocation of the United Nations to anticipate problems, to realize that many of these peoples aspiring to self-determination not only have a right to self-determination, but that if they do not get it, that might ultimately develop into a threat to local, regional, or international peace and security. So let us adopt preventative measures and let us have the self-determination item that used to be a permanent item in the Commission on Human Rights. Let us have the Human Rights Council adopt self-determination as a permanent item in its agenda. And henceforth, let us move forward with a concrete plan of action to implement Resolution 48/7. I thank you.
Thank you, Professor. Okay, thank you very much to Professor Alfred Dzius for that wonderful message. Now we would like to turn our attention to the Hawaiian Islands, and for that we look to H.E. Leon Kalahau-Siu, Minister of Foreign Affairs of the Hawaiian Kingdom. Minister Siu, thank you so much for joining us today. The floor is yours. Thanks.
Mahalo. It's my pleasure to be here. And thank you so much to both Ron Barnes and Alfred Dzius for their wonderful presentations and for bringing an analysis of what is really going on and talking about 48/7 of the resolution adopted by the General Assembly, by the Human Rights Council last October. And, you know, actually in our, the prelude to this discussion, we talked about two different resolutions. One was adopted last December, actually December 2020, and that was the General Assembly adoption of Resolution 75/123. And that is the declaration of the fourth international decade for the eradication of colonialism. And then, of course, the other one was the one that Dr. Dzius and Ron Barnes spoke about, which is the negative impact on the legacies of colonialism on the enjoyment of human rights. But I wanted to talk a little bit about the irony of the words colonialism and the adoption of these kinds of powerful and very good sounding resolutions. But the fact that they have to adopt these and without any kind of real meat to them or without any kind of follow through is really very, it indicates an insincerity and perhaps a real reluctance to actually pursue decolonization on the part of the United Nations and also the other member states of the United Nations. I appreciated Dr. Dzius naming the various countries that abstained from the adoption of 48/7 because that is very indicative of the sort of the cowardice of what is going on with the approach to decolonization. In other words, people don't want to commit to it. The United Nations does not want to commit to it. So going back to the declaration for the fourth decade, what happened to the first decade? What happened in the second decade? What happened in the third decade? We're in 30 years have passed since the announcement and a declaration that the United Nations was going to strive to eliminate or to eradicate colonialism. And nothing has happened. Literally nothing has happened. Since 1985, when there were 16 nations or 16 nations on the list to be decolonized, nothing has happened. It's still 16. And in fact, in 2013, one more was added, and that is French Polynesia, was added to the static list. It's almost like a list that never moves and nothing happens. All they could do is go through the formalities of decolonization or reports, but nothing actually happens. The ironic thing is that since 1985, there have been many countries put back on the, actually that have gained membership in the United Nations and become independent states. A whole bunch of them were from the dissolution of the Soviet Union. And so that was a different circumstance. This was not a decolonization, or at least it wasn't decolonization through the United Nations procedures. It was really a whole different thing. But there are two countries since then, since 2000, that have become independent, and that is East Timor, Timor-Leste, and South Sudan. And in those instances, the reason the UN acted was because of genocide. Actually, there was so much violence that it really amounted to genocide in these two places. And the UN was forced to intervene and eventually work on the granting of self-determination, or the granting of decolonization to these countries. And so what has happened is that the United Nations, where they have one peaceful process, the Decolonization Committee, or the C24, and in that process where 17 nations are still parked there since 1985. And the other way is to allow things to deteriorate to such a great extent that they become extremely violent, and the UN has to step in. So it seems like what the UN is actually doing, not seems, it's apparent by their action, that what the UN is doing is not using the peaceful means of self-determination and decolonization, but they're not moving until they absolutely have no other choice by allowing violence to prosper. So the effect of the UN's decolonization efforts is actually to promote violence. Violence is the only way that the UN is actually going to move on the issue of decolonization. And this is totally contrary to the UN Charter and to the purposes of the UN and all these high-sounding resolutions that they produce. Now, so what happened in the first, second, and third decade? Nothing happened. And instead, the countries that were decolonized had to rely, or had been forced to, through violent actions within their own countries. So what's taking the UN so long to act upon this terrible situation? It's dragging its feet, obviously, and it hasn't decolonized a single country since 1985. All it does is it makes these declarations. It keeps on declaring decades for the eradication of colonialism. And then, of course, in this negative impact on the legacies of colonialism, these are just rhetoric. It turns out that these are just rhetoric. They don't really apparently intend to do anything about decolonization. If they did, we would actually start to see some action, and which the resolution on the negative impact and the legacies of colonialism calls for. The UN thinks that if it just keeps on declaring decades for the eradication colonialism and calling attention to the negative impacts, that somehow this is going to suffice for actual decolonization. And this is the epitome of deception and delusion, or outright deception of what there really is, what's really going on. Not only, let's see, let's see where I am. Again, it's highly contrary to the very foundation of principles of the UN, the peaceful settlement of disputes. And instead, we find the UN is not responding until things get so out of hand that they have to respond. And this is a pity, because it looks like those of us who are stuck in the UN's inaction having to do with decolonization, we don't really want to get involved in a violent situation. So the verbiage referring to colonialism used to say, as Ron Barnes pointed out, all manifestations of colonialism. And what that does is it acknowledges that colonialism comes in all forms. And so to look simply at the physical or the political status of a nation as referring to decolonization, this unfortunately is not the only place where colonialism exists. And that colonialism exists as a mindset and as a practice, as part of what Dr. Dzius pointed out, the legacies or the vestiges of colonialism. But these are not just vestiges, these are just embedded practices that are going on. And we're talking about things like Dr. Dzius pointed out, the World Bank, and all the other systems of a so-called civilized modern society that is basically the global society now, or the global pattern for society, all has to do with colonial practices. And it's very difficult to find a country that is not, particularly in the UN. The UN itself is an organization formed on colonial patterns and colonial templates. So what we see is colonial templates are spread all over the world, and people in different countries, even though they were once colonies, physical and political colonies, are still expected to act as colonial countries. Otherwise, you're left out of the mix, and there's pressures that are come to bear, such as loans and World Bank. This morning, I participated in a side event for the Oceans Conference that's being held currently in Lisbon. And I was on a panel talking about finances for blue bonds, financial system to help indigenous peoples or to help nations, ocean nations, islands, to better themselves and to improve their worth or improve their situations. Unfortunately, again, the whole idea of a debtor system or a system in which one goes into debt to get the resources or the finances needed to improve one's lifestyle actually that's again the vestige of colonialism, because it puts that country or those people under an obligation to repay that debt. So in order to improve their own lifestyles, they have to go again into a form of slavery or become colonialized one more time to those that are lending the money. And so this is really unfortunately, it's the system and how it operates. And unfortunately, those that even mean well, those that are providing the funds, don't even notice or recognize the fact that they're participating in perpetuating a form of colonialism. And this is a big problem, because one cannot be decolonized unless you stop using this colonial systems. Yeah. So I am actually the founder of an organization called the Decolonization Alliance, and we used to hold a number of dialogues in New York called the Decol Dialogues, in which we invited a number of people from, people interested in decolonization. And some of the participants were ambassadors and other diplomats from who participated at the UN. And so we had this one presentation where we talked about how, what steps could be taken, practical steps could be taken, particularly by the religious organizations. And in this particular case, we were talking about churches that are in areas that were decolonized, but are kind of still in a colonial system. And we talked about what can the church do to assist in acts of repentance to help to alleviate or to help to reverse the effects of colonialism in the areas that they're in, because many of these churches actually participated in the colonizing of these countries. And so now, if the church wanted to repent from that action, then what would they do? And so I was speaking with the ambassador from Palau, and he said something very surprising to me. I asked him, what can the church in your community do to reverse or to, as an action, to show repentance toward the colonial thinking that has been embedded in your society? And he immediately said, breastfeeding. And I was kind of surprised by that. Now, it turns out the ambassador, his name is Caleb Otto, was a pediatrician. And so he was a baby doctor. And he said breastfeeding. And I thought, well, could you please explain that? He said, well, our people, our women, were convinced by the colonial forces that came in that, and this is pervasive throughout all of the things that are native, that the Western way is better than the native way. So it comes down to even breastfeeding. They said, well, no, you shouldn't breastfeed your child. You should feed them this formula. And of course, the formula is provided by these companies, Carnation and Nestle and all these companies that make baby formula. But they convinced generations of women that their own breast milk was not sufficient or adequate for the raising of their own children, for the feeding of their own children. So they used formula. They switched off to formula. But as a result, we found generations of young Palauans growing up without the immune systems or the immunity that they needed, without many of the hormones that were needed at childhood. And that affected their health, their general health, and it affected whole 2-3 generations of their people, so that they were not only unhealthy, but they were the performance in many of the activities that they were involved in, including government, was pretty noticeable that some of these people were having problems because of their health. And so what Ambassador Otto was saying, that if we wanted to change, if we wanted to decolonize the minds, the church needed to go ahead and instruct or tell these women that they really should breastfeed, that they should prepare their children to be much stronger and healthier for their lives. And in doing so, we actually help to reverse the colonial thinking that native peoples are inadequate in all their ways. So this would help to reverse that whole idea of inadequacy and incompetence and things like that. And so I thought that this is a brilliant idea. And so that the way to reverse colonialism, particularly in societies that have been colonized in that way, the way to reduce the effects of colonialism is to start to convince the people that they can not only feed their own babies with what God made them, the equipment that God made them and gave them to use, but also that their own foods are better for them to eat than all of the processed imported foods that they get from afar, and also that their own customs and their own way of thinking, their way of life is actually not only adequate, but is actually very, very much superior to the adoption of some other culture that is overlaid upon the culture of your land. And in particular, it would start to reverse the idea of stewardship. It would start to improve the idea of stewardship of their land, and the way of their forefathers actually was not only an adequate way, but it was the best way for them to deal with their living and in their society. So the idea of colonialism can be addressed, and the idea of these vestiges of colonialism can be addressed by changing the attitude of how we approach our activities during our time, the way we think, and the food we eat, and these types of things, very basic. And that would have a cumulative effect toward people gaining more confidence and being more trusting in their own customs and their traditions, and being able to apply that to how they approach the challenges that they're facing right now. So there are many challenges that are going on. Sea level rise and is one of the most critical ones in small islands. And so the idea is that rather than looking for solutions that are created someplace else, look for what you think you need, and then you go and you develop the programs and the projects that you need to solve your problems within your own. You can get the world's help, but you're the one that calls the shots. It's not somebody else making decisions for you and just providing everything. And many times their second guessing of your needs does not work, and it becomes a real burden and a failure, in fact. So going back to the resolution that I passed, as I said, to sum up, that these resolutions are good and well, and they sound good, but really it's rhetoric. And we need to take that rhetoric and really hold the feet to the fire of the countries and of the UN mechanisms that are putting out this rhetoric, and say, you need to actually implement these, and it needs to be done in a sincere way that includes self-determination on the part of the people who have been harmed by colonialism, and that this is an urgent need right now, and that this needs to be addressed. So I'm looking forward to the Human Rights Council session 51, when hopefully the discussion will actually be a serious discussion of not just the proposals for decolonizing, but actual plans of action for it. Mahalo. I appreciate this time.
Thank you, Minister Siu. This time, I have a pre-recorded 9-minute video presentation talking about the situation in Luchu or Okinawa. Of course, Luchu or Okinawa continues to this day to struggle against the harmful impact of both the U.S. and Japanese imperialism and colonization. So we'd like to share that with you now. Just 1 second here. Before I continue, I should point out that this video contains images of graphic violence and warfare that may be disturbing to some viewers, so viewer discretion is advised. Since time immemorial, Okinawa was an independent nation known as Luchu, with its own unique culture, history, languages, values, and identity. Luchu maintained close, friendly relations with China, Korea, and Southeast Asia. Luchu prospered as a center of international trade, finance, and cross-cultural exchange, and was the chief facilitator of a large and highly influential maritime trade network that stretched throughout Asia. Luchu was highly respected by other peoples around the world, including Westerners, who marveled at how a small nation such as Luchu was able to build a prosperous society where poverty was virtually non-existent. During the 19th century, Luchu became recognized by the international community as an independent country via the signing of treaties with the United States, France, and the Netherlands. In 1879, Japan used its new modern Western-style military to invade and illegally annex Luchu. This would be the first of Japan's many imperialist conquests through World War II. As Japan began to lose the war, it deliberately placed an inordinate amount of military presence onto Okinawa Island with the intent of sacrificing Okinawans in order to protect the Japanese homeland. This resulted in the Battle of Okinawa in 1945, in which roughly 1/3 of the indigenous Okinawan population was killed during a time span of just around 3 months. Japanese soldiers used the battle as a cover-up in order to deliberately murder Okinawan civilians, particularly those they caught speaking the native Okinawan language, as well as Luchu independence leaders. Japanese soldiers also used Okinawans as human shields and forcibly conscripted Okinawan civilians into the battlefield, including women and children. After the war, most of Japan's other colonies regained their independence, but not Luchu. Instead, the United States decided to keep Luchu for itself to use for military bases. The United States military forcefully relocated thousands of Luchuans from their ancestral homes and imprisoned those who resisted in order to build these military bases. The United States also released convicted Japanese Class A war criminals such as Nobusuke Kishi because they believed he would lead Japan in a pro-America direction, which is exactly what he did. He would go on to become prime minister. Kishi's grandson, Shinzo Abe, continues the fascist legacy of his grandfather. He and numerous other Japanese politicians are continuously pushing Japan further into a right-wing, neoconservative, imperialist, and fascist direction. Not only are they trying to revive Japan's military strength, but they are also rewriting history, including Japan's textbooks, in order to cover up Japan's war crimes. For this reason, many of the younger generations in Japan today are completely unaware of Japan's dark past as an imperialist aggressor and are under the belief that Japan did nothing wrong. This is a grave concern for many Okinawans because although Okinawa makes up less than 1% of Japan's land area, it contains over 70% of Japan's military presence, which of course means that Okinawa could once again very well be devastated in the event of a conflict. From 1945 through 1972, Luchu was under direct U.S. military rule, which meant that it also missed out on the decades of economic growth that Japan experienced during the 50s and 60s. Luchuans strongly resisted being under U.S. military rule. So in 1972, the U.S. gave Luchu to Japan without a vote from Luchuans in a move that is very much illegal under international law. And today, Luchu remains under joint occupation by both the United States and Japan. both of whom commit major human rights violations against indigenous Luchuans on a daily basis. The military takes up around 15% of Okinawa's land and around 30% of its arable or best lands, but contributes only around 5% to Okinawa's economy, running at a huge deficit. This is, of course, a tremendous economic burden on the Okinawan people, many of whom are forced to work 2 or 3 jobs just to get by. Okinawa maintains a very high child poverty rate at around 25%. The U.S. military commits numerous crimes against Okinawan civilians, particularly violent crime against women and children. The United States military is also responsible for tremendous environmental destruction in Okinawa, including the current construction of another U.S. military base in the northern part of Okinawa at a location called Henoko. The base's construction is destroying an ancient coral reef home to hundreds of rare and endangered species, including the Okinawa dugong. In February 2019, the Okinawan people held a referendum in which the overwhelming majority voted against the construction of this base, and yet both the United States and Japan governments simply ignored the referendum and are continuing to build the base anyway. To make matters worse, the U.S. military has also poisoned Okinawa's water with cancer-causing chemicals, forcing thousands of Okinawans to buy bottled water. The U.S. and Japan governments claim that this heavy military presence is necessary in order to protect Okinawans from China. However, very few people believe that, and even the U.S. government has privately admitted that Okinawans do not see China as a threat. We know this via WikiLeaks, and it was published in the Wall Street Journal. I've done several videos in the past talking about Okinawa's relationship with China. Please check those out if you are interested in learning more. I will, however, say that China and Okinawa have always had very positive, friendly, and mutually beneficial relations. This dates back even to ancient times. China has never once harmed Okinawa or Luchu in any way, and actually China has helped Luchu in many ways. Whereas Japan tries to rewrite history and tries to cover up Luchu's glorious past as an independent nation, China has rightfully acknowledged Luchu's history. And even recently at the United Nations, China played an instrumental role in helping pass a resolution that is being referred to as the Legacies of Colonialism. This resolution is very important and it is being applauded by Luchuans and other oppressed peoples around the world who have experienced the harmful impact of Western imperialism. So no, China is not a threat to Luchu, Hawaii, Guam, or any other nation in the Pacific. Rather, China offers an opportunity at multipolarity, an opportunity to expand our business, trade, and cross-cultural relations in mutually beneficial ways. This is what I and many others believe we should be doing not only with China, but with many other nations around the world. This is how we can build a more peaceful and prosperous society for us all. I'm just about out of time for today, so I'll end here. To learn more or to find ways you can help support us, please visit our website, peaceforokinawa.org. Okay, thank you. Thank you, everyone. We have received many comments, dozens of comments from around the world, particularly from China. Many comments offering their support. Thank you, everyone, for your very kind words. Also, though, many people in China are not surprised at all that the Western nations and institutions are completely ignoring this issue of decolonization and the ongoing legacies, the negative and harmful legacies that colonization continues to exert on many oppressed peoples around the world. Of course, China itself also has experienced these negative impact of colonialism from both Western countries as well as Japan. So they certainly understand our situation. So thank you to everyone in China for your many kind words. We also received an interesting comment from someone saying they are from New Caledonia. Of course, a French colony. They are. We are aware of their struggle, their continued struggle against French colonialism, even to this day. So thank you to New Caledonia for coming out, for showing your support. Thank you to all the comments we received around the world. So at this time, I would like to open the floor to either Ambassador Barnes or Minister Siu. Do you have anything you would like to add? Any comments you'd like to share?
Yes, if I could add something. This is Ambassador Barnes. The issue of puppet governments was one issue that, when talking with North American indigenous peoples, they wanted me to emphasize. Of course, this also relates to China, because when Japan went into China, there's a very good history of them experiencing the issue of puppet governments, installation of governmental entities that do not represent the voice or the will of the peoples of China. So they understand what puppet governments is all about. Of course, when we address this, it's very important, because as I put in my 2006 Shadow Report, which resulted in the Human Rights Committee calling for to address the colonialism in Alaska by calling on the United States to address the permanent trusteeship of Alaska, the issue of puppet governments is vitally important, because again, you cannot use installation of puppet governments to settle an international situation. And of course, we have in the United States with what is rife with puppet governments. And that is to use one example, the Indian Reorganization Act. It's being used right now to buy out water rights of indigenous peoples. And the Indian Reorganization Act has been used in Alaska to deny us what are our free political institutions. Article 73 does not mention puppet governments. Instead, it uses the term free political institutions as opposed to puppet governments. So we need to focus on this question. Just a careful reference, because Alfred did mention the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. Of course, in my presentation, I made it vitally clear that even from Alaska, at a recent National Congress of American Indians, our representatives told some of the indigenous NGOs not to misrepresent Alaska, not to reduce the scope as MRIP. And let me read to you what MRIP proposed in the Right to Development. The manner in which they proposed it was to eliminate the words colonialism, foreign occupation, foreign domination and occupation, which is original text from the Declaration on the Right to Development. And then they gave their rationale, because their rationale is based on fear of attack by colonial or foreign occupying governments. So that shows you that there's intimidation from not only the foreign and occupying governments, but also the fact that there is a lack of attention drawn to the retaliation when you promote and protect the legitimate right of your peoples. Promoting and protecting the legitimate right of your peoples, of course, is when you look at the International Declaration for peoples who are promoting their rights, they have the right to make these complaints, but there is essentially a lack of attention and due diligence to addressing these rights. And we call upon states to address the retaliation, the attacks, and there's not enough done, not only at the Human Rights Council level, but at the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, and even pressure put to bear by individuals within the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights who are secretly said not to address some of these questions. And so this is important to us. I just thought I would add this. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador Barnes. Minister Sue, anything to add?
Yes, actually, I wanted to add something, and that is, thank you very much for the response from the compliment from New Caledonia. New Caledonia is one of those nations that's on the list of non-self-governing territories, which has been going through the process of becoming decolonized, and of course, much to the opposition of France and the many types of ways that France has used to try to derail the independence movement. And I'd like to compliment the people of New Caledonia for getting through that and actually sticking to your guns. And we stand with you in solidarity, particularly in your challenge of the most recent referendum, which you're trying to basically get it invalidated because of how the French manipulated things during the time of COVID to try to get their way in this. But anyway, so we stand with you in solidarity, and we're basically watching along with you about what's going on, and hopefully that you will break the blockage that's been on the decolonization process at the United Nations, that you would actually indeed go ahead and move and vote for independence, which your people have already expressed that they want to do. So mahalo nui, and I just thank you for that. But just again, to show you how much of a struggle this is for even those states or those nations that are under or that are on the list of non-self-governing territories. It's difficult for them to actually move to get to the point of having a referendum without all this interference and blocking by the administrative powers. So thank you very much. Another thing that Alfred brought up was the recent Supreme Court ruling and the opinion given by Justice Gorsuch, which basically says that because the United States in handling or in acquiring and in handling these territories that they claim are under them have actually violated their own laws as well as international laws because of the way that they are treating these territories as if they are US possessions, and they are not. And so the Supreme Court is actually calling them on this, which has a lot to do and a lot of import for us as well. We're not in exactly the same situation, but what the Supreme Court is saying is that there's some shenanigans going on, and has been going on for over 100 years, regarding the United States claims over territories. And those claims are claims that ignore the international status of those territories, and oftentimes ignore even their constitutional rights by saying certain rights of the Constitution do not apply or do apply in deference to the United States interests. So there's some very, very interesting things going on and I think with the United Nations, if the United Nations does get serious about pressing for decolonization and all the legacies of colonialism, I think that we might be on the verge of having some kind of a real breakthrough here. So I'm hopeful, and I'm thankful, and I appreciate the fact that enough countries at the Human Rights Council did vote for this resolution. We're expecting that we can continue this discussion so that it actually results in some concrete actions. Mahalo.
Thank you, Minister Siu. Well, we are past the 90-minute mark. I know we had some technical difficulties to start, so any closing thoughts or final comments from either of you?
Yes, this is Ambassador Barnes. What I will say, and to be hopeful and to attempt to give hope to people who are under colonial domination and foreign occupation, is not to give up, to persist, to pursue your right, because as Alfred and as we recognize in even some states who are very close to China, were very surprised that China initiated this. And so we thank China for granting this hope and then for the support that was given, because it comes at a time where there's an attempt to close the books on decolonization. Now we have the hope, and there's an invitation for an open door to bring us into the process. Mm-hmm. Once we are step into the process, as we are pursuing even in text of the Declaration on the Right to Development as it moves in an attempt to become a legally binding instrument, within these meetings, we will assert that we have the right to diplomacy, to assert our right to diplomatic powers, to respond equally with states when they present some of their false and misleading facts and fallacies, and to justify diminishing effects or diminishing their obligations. So this is why every peoples who is pursuing what they consider now is an unfair practice and unfair position when they attempt to address their rights, either whether they're resource rights, territorial rights, land rights. This will give you a bottom line base for you to pursue your rights with diplomacy equal to states. And I'm asserting this issue of diplomacy and right to diplomatic powers that we need to exercise. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador Barnes. Any final comments, Minister Siu?
No, actually, I don't. I agree with Minister Barnes, with Ambassador Barnes, in that yes, we definitely. I see hope, and I see, and I also encourage people, do not give up, because we're getting there. So, mahalo nui.
Yes. Okay. Well, thank you, everyone, very much for watching. Thank you to In Common Dios for sponsoring this event and for your steadfast support. We really appreciate it. Thank you to the United Nations Human Rights Council for allowing us to speak today. Thank you to our speakers, Dr. Alfred Dzius, Ambassador Ronald Barnes, and Minister Leon Siu, for taking the time out of your very busy schedules to share with us your thoughts. And thank you to everyone for tuning in. Thank you for everyone who commented. The many comments we received, your comments of support, we read them all and we very much appreciate them. Thank you, everyone, again, so much for watching. We hope you will continue to follow us and support us. If you would like to contact any of us, please do not hesitate to do so. You can reach us at the Hawaiian Kingdom, hawaiiankingdom.net, or peaceforokinawa.org. And if you contact either of those sites, we can easily get you in touch with any of our speakers today. Thank you again, everyone, for tuning in, and we'll see you next time.